once we
Thank you very much, David, for this invitation to give a presentation on my work to the Existentialist Society and those who are affiliated with it or join in for these sessions. It's a pleasure to be here today. So, as David mentioned, my name is Luke Fischer. I'm a philosopher and poet, and a lot of my work is at the intersection of those two. So I've published three books of poetry, and I've published various philosophical writings. One of those books, the first is The Poet as Phenomenologist, Rilke and the New Poems, in which I outline a philosophical reading of Rainer Maria Rilke's poetry and engage in various in dialogue with various phenomenologists and so on. And my most recent book, at this sort of intersection of philosophy and poetry, but coming from the side of philosophy, let's say, is the book David just mentioned, Philosophical Fragments as the Poetry of Thinking, Romanticism, and the Living Present. And I'll just share, I've got share my screen, and then you should be able to, I've got an image of the cover of the book there. And I'll just get this slideshow happening. So there you can see the cover of the book. And as you can tell from the title, it's perhaps worth mentioning that the reference point of this book is more, it's closer to Romanticism, especially early German Romanticism, than existentialism, but I'm very informed by phenomenology too in my approach to these questions. So I'll say a little bit about how this book emerged, because it's an unusual work of philosophy or poetics or both. And especially in our time where there's been a tendency to think that philosophy only happens in the form of a treatise or extended logical argumentation. But of course, the history of philosophy is much broader than that. We think of the fragments of the pre-Socratics, or the apophthegms, for example, of Heraclitus, or the dialogues of Plato. And the letter is another genre that's been important in the history of philosophy. And of course, there have been philosophers also in the 20th century who were themselves playwrights and poets and so on. So philosophy can happen across various genres. And this particular book is exploring the genre of the fragment, which is sometimes referred to as the aphorism or aphoristic writing. But this term fragment stems from the early German Romantics. Friedrich Schlegel was, in a way, the sort of leading figure in that group, but Novalis, or Friedrich von Hardenberg, was the close friend of Schlegel's, and along with August Schlegel and Schleiermacher, were sort of centered around Jena in the late 18th century, the final years of the 18th century, and published many fragments in their journal, the Athenaeum. That's where Novalis published his first fragments, known as Pollen or Blütenstaub, and Schlegel as well. And they sometimes publish fragments together, like a mix of fragments from different writers and philosophers in this group. So I mention that partly because it's something I explore in the book, which consists of two parts, and partly because it has to do with how this particular book emerged. So I was approached by the editors of a series at Bloomsbury, Studies in Philosophy and Poetry, about whether I had a book manuscript plan, and I suggested what became this particular book. And I'll just show you the contents page. So the book has two main parts to it. The first part I've called Poetological Fragments. And I like the word poetology, poetological. It's actually, the German is quite a common word in literary criticism, poetologisch or poetologie, but in English it isn't. And I like the kind of combination of the poet in there and also the logical and sense of the philosophical and bringing those two together. So the first part of the book is a bit over 500 of my own fragments. And the second part of the book is an essay on the fragment, which is the title of the essay is partly comes from one of my own fragments that where I refer to the fragment as a philosophic poem. And in this essay, I look a bit at the early German Romantics, but also other figures like Nietzsche and Heraclitus, Simone Weil, and others, and situate the fragment and the things that the fragment can reveal to us about philosophy more generally, because I don't think the fragment is only significant as its own form, but actually shows something about the very process of doing philosophy or a way of doing it that's relevant more generally. So this particular book started actually when I was undergraduate many years ago. I would already have sort of journals where I wrote down my philosophical thoughts. And after reading Novalis and Friedrich Schlegel, I became more aware of the fragment as a philosophical form, and one that has this close affinity for me to poetry, as it did for those early romantics, because it's a fragment is much more about, in a way, capturing the essence of a thought in a few words. And there's also, I think, often a dynamism in the way a fragment emerges, that you have the intuition of something and then you try to capture that in words, and of course can revise that later. But something, many people have written in notebooks, and so my practice some years ago went from writing down philosophical thoughts to writing fragments more consciously. And then the process of writing this book, I went through many journals and typed up fragments and edited and added to them, and chose the ones that I thought worked well together and made sense in relation to one another. Because of the nature of the form of the fragment, and it's not, I don't think there's any one clear definition of the fragment. It overlaps with many other short forms of writing and of doing philosophy, and the boundaries between these are not clear. There are some scholarly works to try to set out, how do these different forms relate to each other: pensée, apophthegms, thoughts, aphorisms, koans, maxims, proverbs, witticisms, and so on. We could add philosophical tweaks to that today as different ways of doing philosophy in a short form. And because of this, the aim of the fragment for pithiness, it would seem in a way contrary to the spirit of the fragment for me to give a very long presentation on what constitutes a philosophical fragment. So what I thought I'd do today is share some of the fragments in my book, and then for about 25 minutes, something like that, and then we'll open it up to conversation. In terms of the relationship between the fragment and philosophical thought more generally, of course, Nietzsche is important, and one of his, I think, very interesting statements from the Twilight of the Idols, which has to do with the brevity and pithiness of the fragment. Nietzsche writes, "My ambition is to say in 10 sentences what everyone else says in a book, what everyone else does not say in a book." So this effort to say more and something other for Nietzsche in fewer words is part of his ambition. And this echoes something from a French writer of fragments before him, Joseph Joubert, who was writing around the same time as the Romantics, but independently or in France. And he spoke of his ambition always to put a whole book in a page, a whole page in a sentence, and this sentence in a word. So I thought I'd leave the more extended discussion of the fragment as a form and the things I treat in the essay in this book to the conversation, which made me think of a statement by Friedrich Schlegel, one of his fragments. In part of that, he says, "A dialogue is a chain or garland of fragments." So we'll see whether what emerges in the conversation, whether we can weave together different fragments and points of view that might complement one another, or at least stimulate further thinking. So I'll now share for about 20 minutes or so some of these fragments. The book is loosely, the section of poetological fragments is loosely divided into sections, but this is something that I arranged later, not in the process of writing them. So on poetry and language is the section where this appears. 1. Poetry is the natural way of speaking of an enlivened consciousness. 2. The contemporary poet is at once individual mind and the living zeitgeist of a language. 3. The poet adapts a language to be the expression of present spiritual life, makes it accord with her own consciousness. Without poetry, language is to the soul as a straitjacket is to bodily expression. 4. An employment of language that sought to be entirely new would be meaningless. There would remain no context to make it intelligible. Much of everyday parlance only repeats what is already contained in a given language. Poetry is the dynamic present, language in evolution. 5. The dynamic present equals the transformation of the inherited past and the arrival of the future. We should not aim to return to the determinate forms of early Romanticism, which is the nostalgic temptation of the scholarly temperament. But concerning the creative spirit of Romanticism, this still belongs to the future. 29. Technological advance is, from a certain perspective, all the same. The one-dimensional reiteration of the concept of innovation. Poetry is genuine progress, an advance in imagination, thought, language, and feeling. 30. What is original springs from an origin. Originality bears the trace of the identity between being and thinking, the living present of awareness that founds itself. 31. The figure is the image of the origin. The concept is the silhouette of the figure. 33. Modern poetry is the rejoining of the concept to the figure, the resurrection of the concept. 53. The poet does not animate things, project emotions into them, personify the impersonal, mythologize a disenchanted world. Rather, she discovers a significance that transcends the reductive materialism of modernity and the facade of a mechanistic cosmos. She lets things speak, such that they reveal themselves as animate, alive, expressive, personal, mythical. 76. The meaning of poetry is in the search for a deeper truth whose essence is poetic and can be best conveyed in poetry. This is the true gold. Poems of this kind do not clothe some otherwise unpoetic content in a linguistically appealing form. Rather, their aesthetic surface is the natural expression of an intrinsically poetic insight. Well-crafted poems that lack this poetic content resemble, by comparison, polished fool's gold. 83. The starting point of poetry is faith in the interconnectedness of all things, inner and outer, sense and spirit, high and low, large and small. 90. Poetry is white magic with words, the art of conjuring being into imaginal presence. 100. To compose poetry is consciously to raise a given language towards the condition of the primordial language, or Ursprache, in which phonemes mean, by virtue of their very sounding, and euphony. I'm just going to read one fragment that's not in my slide presentation. So this is from the section titled On Philosophy and Freedom. 101. That within us which recognizes our finitude is that which transcends our finitude. 110. The individual act of universal significance that is thinking is the act of freedom, both the free act and the freeing act. The free act in that thinking only comes about through self-activity. The freeing act in that thinking, as knowing, liberates the knower from any unconscious hold of that which is known. 115. Just as thinking transcends thought, an artwork is never equal to the infinity of the creative spirit that brought forth this work and can bring forth others. 136. Modern science proceeds by way of an antithetical polarity and the union of this polarity. Its observations are confined by a reductive empiricism, and it theorizes about empirical data by way of lifeless abstract ratiocination, lacking the mediating and enriching dimensions of sensitive empiricism and concrete imagination, rather than the art forms of nature and the music of life. It sees only data, mechanisms, resources. (164). The fragment is nomadic philosophy. (166). Each fragment arrives in a lightning flash. A sequence of fragments strikes successively from the same part of the sky. (175). Systematicity has its discipline, but intuitivity has its discipline too. Devotion to the sources of thought, to the living nous. As the poet is devoted to poetry and realizes this devotion in poems, the writer of Fragments is devoted to intuitive thinking, a sibling of contemplation or meditation. (176). The fragment is a prose poem, more precisely, a philosophic poem. So this is now moving into the central section because there are five, the poetological fragments are divided into 5 sections, and the middle of those 5, number 3, is on the alchemical transmutation of philosophy and poetry. 246. Philosophy is the extrication of thinking from everything that is not thinking, and the articulation of the world from the standpoint of this liberated thinking. Through this extrication, it alchemically divides the universe into sensibility and rationality, experience and reflection, empiricism and ideality, lead and light. Poetry is the transmutation of the lead into gold. 247. The philosopher is a disembodied spirit, an angel. The poet is human. 251. Philosophy is the view from the mountain. Everyday life takes place in the valley. Poetry is the view from the hills. 272. Both poetry and philosophy start with wonder, then they diverge. Philosophy proceeds to give an account, while poetry explores the wonder from within, holds open the mystery. Dwelling in the mystery becomes its own kind of revelation, the world as manifest to the eyes of wonder. (283). A phenomenology of the poetic state of the soul. I wander in a place, town or landscape, with a heightened receptive attentiveness to my surroundings. The boundaries of my psyche seem to expand well beyond their usual circumference and form a porous interface with the world. I realize that I've spent days, months, perhaps years in a self-enclosed cell of philosophical thought, discerning in judgment, but dull to the sense world. In this poetic state, the sense world becomes more than merely sensuous. It comes to expressive life. soul and world attuned to one another, like two strings of a viola that are played by a single bow. The imagination starts looking for metaphorical connections that illuminate what it perceives, weaving threads between phenomena and between self and world. It traces and makes the text of being. (298) Towards imaginative cognition, imagination as an organ of knowing, and beyond the interdependent polarity of intellectual interiority and empirical exteriority. In imaginative cognition, poetry finds itself at home in the cosmos and becomes a mediator of insight into the universe and the human self. In imaginative cognition, science or knowledge becomes as enlivening as the experience of art, and it thus holds the potential to overcome the opposition between thought and will. Living thought contains within itself the impulse to action, in the same way that the experience of artworks inspires an artist to create. In imaginative cognition are the beginnings of a future culture that can lead beyond the destructive and dead realities of the present. (299) A key to the fundamental unity of nature is in the principle whereby what is latent in one aspect of nature becomes more fully manifest in another aspect. But it is not sufficient merely to state specific analogies, metamorphoses, or degrees of realization of a certain tendency. One must ascend to an intuitive and imaginative insight into these connections, perceive with the mind's eye how in diverse manifestations and levels of nature, a unity is variously realized. (336) The human being is the striving to overcome contradictions. (337) Knowing resolves the oppositions in our being between the real and the ideal, the sensible and the intelligible, the outer and the inner, appearance and essence, in the invisible form of thought. Art resolves these oppositions as a phenomenon in the realm of appearance. (349) The poetic state of mind can think in a penetrating manner, but it doesn't incline to lead thinking into the heights that are abstracted from feeling. As the kite of thought ascends, it holds the string close to the heart. (353) The act of writing poetry not only integrates the various polarities and capacities of the human being, but also in certain instances seems to accomplish the highest and most complex intellectual act, superior to philosophy. The singular complexity of this act is reflected in the intensity of the experience of poetic writing, the immense powers of concentration that it demands. In a few words, through allusion, wordplay, symbolism, metaphor, expressive euphony, the poetic mind knits together multiple threads drawn from the near and the far, the present and the remote past, diverse traditions, the small and the large, the visible and the invisible, separate bookcases of a personal library, thus revealing hidden and meaningful connections between them. This noetic synthesis and syncretism of utmost compression is also what makes its language inexhaustible and ever open to fresh interpretations. So this is now moving into section titled on art, music, and nature. 386. On the one hand, the work of art is obviously a realization of freedom, the creation of a new entity, the distinctive work through the individual artist. On the other hand, in the appreciation of a great work of art, we experience a necessity. This necessity is at least twofold. First, there is the sense of necessity in the internal coherence of the composition, the sense that the work is the consummate realization of its content. Everything is as it must be in relation to everything else. Second, there is a perhaps even more mysterious experience of necessity in the sense that the work is necessary to the progress of humanity, the feeling that the world needed this work and would be deficient without it. Imagine, for example, a world in which Bach's or Beethoven's music did not exist. Would it be the same world? (387). Yet this world historical necessity is achieved by a singular individual and a biography with all its contingencies. 388. The exemplary individual is the true universal. The more individual, the more universal. 405. If anything, is not art the greatest demonstration that the sensible, far from being the opposite of the spiritual, is its manifestation? 409. Goethe's passive colours, blue to indigo, and active colours, yellow to red, are equivalent to the division of tonality into minor and major scales. The polarity of the spectrum can also be described as introverted and extroverted colours, contemplative and outgoing, contractive and expansive, cool and warm. But there are countless variations: warmer and cooler blues, warmer gold and cooler yellows, lemon. Green is the equalization of the poles, according to Goethe, and music that conveys a contentment between sadness and joy is its sonorous equivalent. 410. On this basis, it also makes perfect sense to speak of someone having a blue personality and another a yellow personality. Color, music, mood, character, various of the countless examples of the analogicity or metaphoricity of being. 425. Interactive virtual worlds, a new phenomenon. Simulacra that no longer reflect or reveal the world, in contrast to art, but confine the subject to alternate subworlds. The complete severance of the bond, the magical tie between imagination and being. Imaginal solipsism. 437. What is it to be an artist? It is to resist the horizontal flow of time. It is through the power of imagination to bend the stream such that the vertical is drawn into the vortex. 446. Philosophy is conflict. Art is reconciliation. 447. Even when it deals with loss, strife, alienation, and tragedy, art reconciles us with the night, finds an unlikely ember in the ashes. 449. Artists feel the ideas that philosophers think. Philosophers think the ideas that artists feel. Many artists only feel the ideas. Many philosophers only think the ideas. Some, in feeling, think, in thinking, feel. Only then, when they are understood and felt, can the ideas properly benefit life. 452. Art is the creative becoming of the world. 453. Art is the creative becoming of the individual. 454. The separation of the self and the world is an abstraction, an illusion. 457. Artistic creation is at once active and receptive, transformative and sensitive to the characteristics of its material. In fashioning a unique work, the painter must be attuned to color, the poet to language. This same dual capacity, when adapted to the practical realm, is genuine ethical freedom. What in art is sensitivity to the medium, in the practical realm is sensitivity to other individuals, social contexts, and so on. What in art is creative activity, in the practical realm is freedom, individual transformative action. The ethical individual is neither a megalomaniac, activity without reception, nor a conservative, receptive without creative activity. Ethical freedom and sensitivity to others form an interdependent polarity that is analogous to that of the artistic process. In short, art is a model for the attainment of freedom and the positive transformation of society. 459. The evolution of organisms is an artistic process. The relation between a seal's flippers or a penguin's wings and the element of water is of the same character as the relation between a distinctive work of art and its medium. David to marble, seal to water. So I'm going to just read one last fragment now. This is the from the last section, but I'll just read one from this, and the heading is on practical aesthetics and society. 463. The deepest societal and political significance of art does not reside in its content, but in its individualized and creative energies, which counter the rigid conformism imposed by governments, managerialism, and bureaucracy. In his idea of social sculpture, Joseph Beuys realized the progressive forces in the expansion of art into life. Art is living meaning, anarchic but coherent, individualized yet universally significant. It is the metamorphosing tree in contrast to the dead skeletons. It presses moisture into the hardened clay, the rigidified forms of life. Art enlivens and renews and can foster communities of individuals, not ruled by an external law, but acting out of individual impulses that harmonize with one another. So I won't read any more fragments, but I will just say a few words about the essay part of this book, and then we can lead into questions and conversation. So, as I mentioned, it's the essay is called the Fragments philosophic poem, and you can see the different headings, the different sections of that essay. Some of them are language is Delphi, comes from Novalis. In 10 sentences, a book is from Nietzsche, and a flash of eternity and metaphoricity of being from my own fragments that I used to head sections of the essay. And some of the things I explore in the essay, and in a way start out from, is the tension between, but also relationship between more systematic ways of doing philosophy and the fragment as this more intuitive but less systematic form of philosophy. So the relationship between fragments and the whole of which it is a fragment, the relation between intuition and discursivity, the relation between having a new idea, which I think is what's really encapsulated in a fragment, versus defending that idea at length in a more conventional treatise, and other connections, individuality, universality, metaphor, and concept, with metaphor, say, playing a larger role in fragmentary writing. But that said, I point out things like the use of aphorisms in Hegel, for example, one of the most systematic philosophers, and metaphor. And then there's some of the traditions and thinkers I refer to there on the screen. So you might have questions interrelation to some of those points. I tried to read fragments that would also stimulate some thought on those topics, or open up some questions about the topics that are there. So yeah, we can open it up to conversation now, and thank you for listening.
Well, thank you, Luke, for your presentation. Now, before we throw the meeting open to questions, comments, and discussion with Luke, I have a couple of announcements. The first of which is that the next Existentialist Society's monthly lecture discussion will take place on Saturday, the 4th of October at this time. And Dr. Desmonda Lawrence is presenting Fernando Pessoa, Portuguese literature. So that's in 1 month's time. Fernando Pessoa, Portuguese literature. Now, the Existentialist Society has weekly Zoom sessions at this time on highlighting various groups. So to find out what the topics and speakers are, I'll put the link to the Existential Society's meetup page in the chat, and you'll be able to see what's coming up each week. Now, for our questions, comments, and discussion section, we'll use the raised hand method, and you'll find the raised hand icon in the React tab at the bottom of your screen. So perhaps we could start with Luke. Would you like to stop share your screen?
Yeah, thanks. Let me just see how I do that.
That should be on the,
okay. Yeah, done.
Yeah, good. So, George, it's your turn.
All right. Thank you very much for that presentation. I really enjoyed parts of it. And I'm, you're here presented before us. I'm going to take the work very seriously. I'm going to offer some commentary. And now I'll start off by saying that, I viewed your presentation sort of in two parts. The second part was in many ways very interesting. I mean, I'm going to say to you again, just as by offer as constructive criticism, I didn't think the part on poetry was all that helpful. I thought it was a bit mechanical, telling us what poetry is. Whereas the latter part, and this is the thing about poetry. We live in a world of things that are and aren't. Love, justice, fairness, right? These are things that exist but don't exist, or don't exist and exist. And so certainly poetry, right? As again, as you show us, right? I think that's the problem with the first part. You're telling us. Later you show us that poetry transcends, captures that synergism between what is and what isn't, right? And it's almost as if it's another dimension, right? So what is one dimension, here's metaphorically, what is not is another dimension. So justice exists both as a metaphysical thing, but it is also manifest in terms of society, etc. Love exists as a metaphysical thing, but also manifests itself. So poetry occupies a kind of additional dimension, again, speaking metaphorically, that straddles that process, right? If I could say. And we see that. We see that in your latter fragments. And so in this way, what I'm going to say is that, I guess, and the fragments are interesting, no doubt about it. And this is not a criticism, but it's just an observation. I mean, an issue is that you are operationalizing, animating continental philosophy, right? And I guess the only point will be that, it sort of speaks to the initiated, right? And I'm not even sure if that's a criticism or not. I'll just make that commentary to you. So as a continental philosopher, or someone that thinks in that in those nodes, in that realm, better said, it spoke to me in many important ways. The other point I'm just going to bring up, which is that and this is what I would say, I would ask you to contemplate, the danger of the fragment. The danger of the fragment, right? Because I'm going to be a little bit strident here. I consider Nietzsche to be a total idiot. I mean, and that's my opinion of him. And he operates with these fragments, right? And so he just blurts out statements. Now, some people, forgive me for being so blunt about it, other idiots find these fragments interesting. But there's just biases and hate and reaction and backwardness in those fragments, right? So the racist could rely on fragments. The hate monger can rely on fragments. So I share, my only point will be, just as a point of thought, listening to you, and again, I think a lot of it is very brilliant. Don't get me wrong. I think a lot of it is very brilliant. I'm simply trying to interact with you intellectually here. Simply to say that if we're going to talk about the benefits of fragments from an analytical, existential point of view, we also have to talk about the limits or the potential liabilities of fragments. So I wanted to say that, and I'm going to throw in one more point for good measure, one of your fragments I sort of disagreed with because you said the philosophy creates conflict. Art conciliates. Art is philosophy through a means, right? I mean, art is philosophy conflict. As a matter of fact, the most powerful philosophy is conflictive. I mean, one of my most famous, in my mind, a really great fragment, and this is in the aftermath of the American invasion of Iraq. Somebody wrote a poem, and the fragment stands out in my mind. Says George W. practices a strange kind of alchemy, red blood into black gold, right? So there's an oppositional, there's a critique, right? And it brings that argument really, really into focus. So I guess, I mean, I know you said a lot of things. Don't get me wrong. I'm just focusing on that one about art is conciliatory. I don't know, again, just got my intellectual wheel spinning. But thank you very much. I really found it very interesting. Again, to be honest with you, the second half, the latter parts, I found very compelling. Thank you.
Thank you very much, George, for those comments and thoughts, and quite a lot to respond to. I mean, one of the points of the fragment is, of course, to stimulate thinking, and with also having, perhaps tension within fragments. So I think, maybe sometimes, writers of fragments or aphorisms, say contradict themselves even, and so on. But I don't think that's really the aim. It's more to also stimulate thinking, and in a way leave the resolution of the problem to some extent to the reader. And I mean, a lot of what my essay is about, I mean, I think Nietzsche as an aphorist, I mean, he's not so important to me. Actually, the Friedrich Schlegel and Novalis are more important to me as writers of, aphoristic, fragmentary writers. So I think in the case of Nietzsche, there's a question of what his actual philosophy is, and I think that's separate from to some extent, separate from the genre of the fragment, or they're not. You can't just conflate those two, because I think there are good philosophers. In fact, like, I'm just leaving that question of Nietzsche's status as a philosopher in parentheses, but there are brilliant philosophers who work in fragments, I think. So part of what I do in the essay is really talk about this tension between, for example, fragment and system, and where those work. Obviously, if you want a really detailed, argument about something, and references to all the secondary literature on the topic and so on, the fragments is not the form for you, right? But even within systematic philosophy, I think what the fragment is, I sort of side the fragment with, the sort of intuitive dimension of thinking, the moment of like illumination when one has a new thought, this kind of very dynamic, active, intuitive side of philosophy. And I think all philosophers have to have that. Otherwise, you have nothing that you're arguing for. You have no new idea, and there's really no. I mean, you can still write a scholarly work maybe, but you're not contributing something new unless you have that moment of insight, which I think fragments really capture in the most potent way in language. And I think that's, I mean, like, I talk a little bit in the essay, for example, about the famous lines from Hegel's philosophy of right: the owl of Minerva lifts its wings only with the onset of dusk, and philosophy paints in its grey and grey only when a form of life has grown old, for example. Like, that's densely metaphorical, elusive to ancient Greek art in all these ways. And this is from the philosopher who said that pictorial thinking and art are superseded by the concept in his philosophy, and so on. Yet you find these moments of incredible pithiness in Hegel, and I think that those moments are not just, I mean, this is a question for Hegel scholarship, but those moments are actually, in a way, like knitting all these threads together and giving us, in like just a couple of sentences, the heart of something about his whole approach to history and philosophy. So I think there is aphorism and fragment within, say, what are more conventional modes of philosophical writing and treatises. But there's, but on the other hand, I think what I like about the early romantics is that they weren't against system. They, Schlegel says it's equally fatal for the mind to have a system and not have a system. So we have to combine both. It's sort of a gist of one of his fragments, which differs a little bit with, I think, like the fragmentary as just this sort of isolated part, which you get more in modernism, with this sense of like modern Western society become a heap of broken images in Eliot, say, or what we might take from Beckett and others. And then in the postmodern, we have this sense of the fragment as this, the deferral and infinite deferral of presence and so on. And I like the romantics because they're kind of straddling to sort of straddle the between. I think you used that word. They're kind of sitting in between that and recognizing that, there's something like style and, in a way, individuality of a certain kind is more important to the fragment. But it's not anti-system. And that's why it's I think the process for me of collating the fragments is a sense the reader is given more a greater role of trying to make everything cohere. But I think, there are different ways of writing fragments. There should be some kind of coherence kind of there, but one that's not just abstractly deduced from principles or something like that. So that's to sort of respond to some of your your very interesting comments here. Yeah.
Well, thank you, George. DLJ, go ahead.
There you go. Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Hey, that makes a change. Yes, as often, thank you for this, as often with this kind of presentation, when somebody presents something that obviously really matters to them, I need to ask the question, are you after encouragement or criticism?
You should give whatever you want to, feel called to give. I'm a philosopher, I can take either.
I'll give a bit of each. Actually, just a small bit of each, and then I've got a question. I love the word fragment. I think that really, that's quite evocative in itself. I'm thinking patchwork quilts of quotes and emotions and all. Yeah, I'm stealing that. Thank you. Actually, there's not too much criticism, other than I just disagreed with some of the fragments. I think the one George picked up on, I think some of the best art is about conflict. Guernica springs to mind. Anyway, but so yeah, I could critique the actual fragments, but I think the general idea is quite good. Here's the question. You said in the introduction that, well, you implied anyway, that everybody could make notes, right? So we all do this kind of thing. We write down our thoughts. I'd see some actual poets in the room, some of who actually enjoy their poetry. Maboob, looking at you. But Christopher Hitchens once said that everyone has a book inside them, and for most people, that's where it should stay. In other words, a lot of people have got some great ideas, but is there an actual audience for those ideas? So this is where I'm going with this. Are you suggesting that everyone should write down and create their own book of fragments? And here's a fragment to exemplify that. Let's call it Our Contribution to the Algorithm. There you go. That's my little fragment. In other words, who is the audience for this? If we all did this and we wrote our books of fragments, who would read them?
I'm not quite sure how to respond to that question. Maybe I'll start with the other one, the one about art and reconciliation, because obviously you might still disagree with, which is itself good, because hopefully the fragments provoke, the reader or to have their own thoughts. But I think, talking about art in relation to reconciliation, my point is not that art doesn't deal with conflict. Some of the greatest art, going back also in time, like let's say Greek tragedy, it's immense conflict between, this fundamental conflict between the tragic hero and his fate. Which ends in some kind of catastrophe. And that, but yet in the history of interpreting a tragedy and its philosophical significance, even going back to Aristotle, the actual experience of a tragedy, in some sense, and this is just one example, reconciles us with the tragic, the existence of the tragic in the world. And the same, I think, goes for poems dealing with grief and, you know, I don't want to, it's obviously a very complex subject, but my point is not that there's some kind of simple reconciliation going on. There's just, I mean, another fragment that is in that context in the book is refers to something that the late Polish poet Adam Zagajewski said, which on some occasion was basically like that to write a poem is already an affirmation. Like no matter how bleak it is, it's already, there's some kind of affirmation, because when one stops writing, that's when one has completely given up on hope. But the Book of Fragments, I mean, I'm not quite sure what to do with the question, because I wouldn't suggest that everybody write a novel. I wouldn't suggest that everyone write a book of poems. I think there are people who are drawn to writing in that way and write for various reasons in that way. And to me, it came out of this, in part, this relationship between philosophy and poetry.
Can I put it in a different way?
Yeah.
A slightly different way. What gives one person's fragment legitimacy over other people's fragment? I mean, I'm thinking of the audience who would pick up on this and go, yeah. Well, I mean, some people go, oh yeah, I'll put that on my bumper sticker. And for others, it's like that, just they won't be read because they don't have a name, they don't have clicks and likes to their followers and all that kind of stuff. Well, where are you going with this, I think is what my question, right?
I don't know. I think maybe read the book and then ask me the question again, because
Nice.
you know, the book is the argument, right? So I mean, I think, you know, the fragment is a fairly neglected genre of philosophy, which has something to reveal more generally about philosophy itself. And the book is at the same time, obviously, an expression of my own philosophical ideas, an attempt to work in this fragmentary form. And the word, you did mention the word fragment. You know, part of the significance of the word fragment has to do with you know, realms like the areas like archaeology and philology, where like we only have fragments of Sappho's poems, for example. So part of the job of the philologist is to try and sort of grasp the whole of Sappho through the fragments that we have, or when we have fragments of an ancient building and we try and reconstruct what the building is. So that's part of the origin and of the word fragment has to do with that. But a fragment in this more modern sense, or deliberate fragments also in art, has something of that character to it, that it suggests a whole. It's not just an isolated fragment. And that's the first part of my essay in the book, is about thinking about the fragments as fragments of a whole versus the fragment as fragments of a whole. There's just this, and I think different writers of fragments emphasize more or less most of those. But I hope I've partly answered your question, at least in regard to the value of fragments. I think, yeah, I mean, the leading theologian and philosopher and poet Kevin Hart has just written a book of aphorisms. I think they're all one sentence long. So I mean, there are other people writing in this form. Yeah. But it's but I think it's a valid form, and I think in some ways it highlights important aspects of philosophy, like I said, of the moment of actually having a new idea, for example, and the ability to actually condense a lot into a few words rather than have that diluted over a long treatise. I think these are important aspects of doing philosophy, which have become a little bit forgotten.
I get it. This is to pander to the low attention span generations that are coming up behind us. I get it. Sorry,
No, I would say
being
that
flippant, but
fragment
yeah, thank you very
requires
much.
more attention, actually, not less attention,
Ah,
more. Because a fragment doesn't fully elaborate the context in which it is intelligible. So the context has to be, the reader has to play a more active role. I mean, Novalis often use, this goes back to antiquity, of course, often use the metaphor of a seed for a fragment. A fragment is a seed of thinking, which means that, or in his pollen, it's also pollen, this fructifying, that it's meant to the reader, it's meant to stimulate the reader to come into the activity of thinking, rather than, and I think, so I don't think it requires less attention. I think it's more like a poem that way too. Yeah, at least, a serious poem. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
You're welcome.
Michelle, it's your turn. Go ahead.
Well, thank you for giving that lecture. What was your first name again, sir?
Luke.
Luke. Okay. Thanks for the presentation, Luke. It was fantastic. I've been coming here for a little while, and so far one of my favorite presentations by far. I wouldn't say I have any criticisms for you, and it seems like so far you've been getting a lot of them. And I'm wondering why, because it was great. And what really helped me out is I'm like, this guy is writing like I've been writing ever since I've been writing. And I've never really felt totally validated with what I produce in the writing arena, in poetry and philosophy, because they're all just one-liners or a couple of paragraphs. And but that really helped validate my work and my writing. I've got I've got 17 journals, and they're almost all full of just poetry and philosophical fragments that I've written over many years. And I was wondering, the whole calling them fragments, I think that's a little, and what you write, sir, is almost, I want to say, quatrain-esque. If I'm being correct there in the use of quatrain poetry, quatrain-esque. But like fragments, there were whole thoughts. So I'm not sure why you're going with fragments. I mean, I understand why, because there's nothing better than going with fragments. But there were whole thoughts that you could just run wild with.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Michelle, and I'm glad that you found it resonated with your own approach to writing and philosophy. The last, to start with what you just said now, it was sort of part of what I was getting on at in the response to the previous question was, how you think about the relationship between a fragment and a whole. And I think if you place the fragment as if you think of it as being the fragment of a whole, then it's precisely aiming to sort of capture a whole, but in a few words. Well, you could say, while leaving a lot that would be unsaid in a longer treatise, but which is nonetheless implied in the fragment. So I don't see a tension between having a whole thought and a fragment. To me, a fragment in some sense is a whole thought, but then once you collate fragments together, they also engage into dialogue with other fragments. So there's a certain degree of openness to or relatedness between fragments. But one, you might know this from Friedrich Schlegel, but I didn't, it's something I discussed in the book. It's his most well-known fragment, which is about the fragment. But anyway, my essay, maybe it's a bit too much to go into. I sort of say that I distinguish it in that particular moment between an aphorism of a certain kind and the fragment. But he, in terms of the whole, a fragment being a whole, he says, He says, a fragment, like a miniature work of art, has to be entirely isolated from the surrounding world and be complete in itself, like a hedgehog. So he has this, this sense of the fragment is kind of this like microcosmic sort of artwork, and then the quite, humorous reference to a hedgehog. So I think because I don't even think that's a good definition of all of Schlegel's fragments. I think it works for some of them, but because some of them are much more in dialogue with one another, I think it's not completely entirely isolated from the surrounding world.
So-
but I think it captures this sense of, that there's a whole thought in a fragment.
So
Yeah.
So if I have you correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, just because I want to understand the idea of fragments and fragmentation. It's in the sense that what you write is called a fragment. It is a fragment because there are many directions of intellectual discussion that you could take every one of your fragments in your book, but yet it's a whole because you're only speaking about one subject pretty much in each fragment. Is that basically the gist, or do I have
Yeah, I mean, I would say, there's some that a fragment, that it encapsulates a thought, maybe is a way of putting it. In that sense, a fragment is generally a whole in itself. Yeah. But can you remind me the second part of what you just said? The second part of your question just now.
Michelle may have muted himself. I'm just checking.
Okay.
There you are. Michelle, unmute yourself.
Yeah, the second part of my question, if I can remember it correctly, was if I have you correctly, a fragment, like it's a fragment because there's any number of directions, delicious.
Oh yeah,
direction.
sorry, yeah. That's part of it. That's part of it. And maybe the image that Novalis uses of a seed is kind of interesting there too. That is something that could be unfurled in different ways. And the way I ended up presenting the essay in this book is kind of like an expanded fragment. It's a kind of expansion on this fragment, where I say that the fragment is a philosophic poem. So so it's a kind of spelling out of what of what is contained in the fragment, and that again connects back to what I mean by this sort of intuitive moment of thinking, because I think when we have a new idea or have that intuitive thing, experience, aha, that's a thought arrives. We often sort of have this sense of all its implications, like there are lots of implications of this one thought, right? And part of the job of a treatise or an extended treatment is to sort of elaborate all that, sort of unfurl it. But it's all kind of there already in a kind of potency in that initial thought, and I think that's what a fragment can capture.
Right.
Yeah.
So thank you for answering my question. I appreciate it.
Thank you for the good question.
Thank you, Michelle. Stephen, go ahead.
Thanks a lot for that, Luke. Yeah, I read a bit of history, and the curiosity sort of strikes you how predominant, say, poetry was in the time of Elizabeth I. In fact, if you couldn't do a bit of poetry, you were regarded as a great bore. And then by the early 1700s, the world had transitioned. The bean counter was taking over, the dry, the prosaic. And Goethe then appears later as the great revolts against the dryness, so to speak. He saw a risk in it. And so this sort of historic, even though I'm not really a great lover of poetry myself, I saw the historical conundrum there that something's been lost. There seems to be a division between the analytical, the dry, and the prosaic. And on the other side, which seems to be linked with poetry, is the mystical and transcendental. You know, I knew a lady, she was quite enchanted with poetry, and she seemed to go into transcendental states with the stuff. And I thought, oh, there might be more to this poetry stuff I'd ever thought. So we are in the midst of a sort of battle, aren't we, between differing points of view. There are the people that, you know, will say, let's get rid of all this waste, all this nonsense, which is a state of mind which did show up around 1700. I was wondering what you think about that, Luke.
Yeah, I think it's all very important, and in a way, part of my response to the early question about the place of the, you know, why write fragments today, for example, because I think, yeah, we're entering this stage of incredible like passivity, like mental passivity of like, whether it's, you know, entertainment that we just consume, or you know, now most recently with, you know, AI writing essays for students and the rest of it, and so that's why one of the and a kind of, yeah, just a kind of, you know, maybe dullness of a lot of intellectual poetry even perhaps. So I think the fragment is important here, firstly because it's this kind of stimulus to think. It's this kind of yeah, asks the reader to activate their own mind and think. And I also see it as connected to something, yeah, a more contemplative activity, like, you know, the kind of activity that some poetry asks of us and demands of us, in a way that, you know, it's much easier to turn on the telly and passively absorb
I
something,
imagine the
you know,
purpose of
rather
the
than
fragment would be to bring your concentration to the bear. Like when we read stuff, we just run past it. But if you put the fragment there, you're going to spend a lot of time thinking of that fragment from every different angle. I mean, it's like, what's his name wrote the Master and Margarita. I realised to fully read that, you'd have to read it several times to appreciate it properly.
Yeah. No, I think that's how I see fragments, and it's yeah, I gave a presentation on the book when I was recently in Germany, and someone who liked it a lot said, "Oh, I'd need a lot more time to kind of digest them all." So it's a bit, yeah, it is a lot to sort of read a number of fragments in the space of 20 or 30 minutes. But I'd certainly see them as aligned with, or yeah, a kind of, you know, asking us to slow down and to contemplate and to think about things in a more sort of focused way, which is, I think, incredibly important today.
Well, to find questions rather than answers.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Taylor, go ahead.
Hello, I'm Taylor. Dr. Fischer, thank you for your lecture, and thank you to the Existentialist Society for hosting. I just had a comment, and my husband Keenan had a question. I wanted to say that this was very inspiring in a way. I saw in the chat that James had said he'd been Philistine about liking or disliking poetry. And I felt like my whole life I did not really get it, and that I didn't like poetry. More recently, I've dipped my toes into a little bit like more of like good poetry that like elicits both emotion and it's trying to just say something about like the human existence. And I'm realizing, I think what I didn't like about it was that it, like, I feel things very deeply and I think things very deeply, and like good poetry would elicit like just it almost would feel painful to give it so much attention. But I really liked this lecture kind of, you know, kind of introducing me to Fragments, because I feel like that is kind of the way I think and journal. And I feel like coming away from this, I'm going to do some exercises and trying to distill my thoughts and intentionally intuit as kind of like a cathartic and therapeutic exercise. So I just appreciate you gave me that. And I was just gonna point out specifically the fragment that really hit me was the one about wonder, where philosophy takes account of it and poetry holds open the mystery. That's how I feel about thoughts and thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Can I just respond a little bit to that before the next question?
Sure.
Yeah, thank you very much. But yeah, the last point in a way ties in with what I think, you know, a kind of more contemplative thinking is, in a way, you know, there's this sense of dwelling, a kind of dwelling with with the phenomenon, or with what one is thinking, and I think distilling thoughts, fragments as a way of distilling thoughts, also in notebooks and so on. I mean, I'd be interested to know of like philosophers in their practice, because I do often think it's you might have like be working on some larger project, and it's one thought that you happen to arrive at on a certain afternoon that ends up being the key to something much larger. And I think we often, because we focus so much on the moment, the sort of logical elaboration, defense, referencing and so on in philosophy, we can forget that actually something to do with the essence of thinking, maybe not its entirety, but something very important about thinking is more closely affiliated with the fragment as a way of writing than a more extended treatise. So I think it's I've definitely done that when I've stuck with something in philosophy. Like I try and just think, well, what is it that I'm trying to get at here, and that can take time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I was gonna say my background's in law, and so a lot of times I have to kind of the best way to present a legal argument in writing is to dumb it down to just the core essence of what you're trying to say and not dance around it. And so I don't know, I'm just going to go back on my past experiences and kind of be a little bit more, even more intentional when I'm writing down my thoughts. And thank you.
Dr. Fisher, I had a question for you. Thank you so much for your presentation. I too thoroughly enjoyed it. I think you did a great job at blending the two mediums of, philosophy and poetry. My question refers to a specific fragment, and I'm going to try to do my best to remember it because it was pretty early in your presentation. There was something along the lines of language without poetry is a straitjacket to bodily expression. Now, I interpret that to mean that language without poetry is restricted, but isn't also poetry restrictive and in relation to fragmented philosophy? And if not, then where is the intersection between prosaic language and poetic language and fragmented philosophy and, say, meditative philosophy?
Hey, I might try to answer part of what I take to be a question, and you can tell me whether I'm addressing it or not, because there's quite a lot going on in there. The fragment. So part of what I'm thinking of in that sequence of fragments that actually opens the book has to do, and I use poetry in this, I should say, often in this quite broad way, that it's a sort of broad way that the Romantics used it, and then in the 20th century, people like Owen Barfield used the term poetry. So in some sense, it's synonymous with this, you could say the mind in its creative mode or creative activity. So in that sense, philosophy would be poetic in its when the philosopher is conceiving a new idea or articulating an idea in a new way in language. A scientist would be in a poetic mode when they're in the process of discovery, rather than just say maybe repeating an experiment or something like that. And with regard to language, I specifically have in mind the role of metaphor and figurative language in actually extending the meanings of words and bringing new meaning to language. And I think that's what poetic metaphor does, and it does that in science too, when a scientist has to come up with a new a figurative way of conveying a new concept. So, but that happens, I think, most intensively in poetry. In English, maybe Shakespeare is the most exemplary case of his inventiveness into language and how he transformed the English language. So that is language in this process of a kind of dynamic evolution through the poetic act and through poetic writing. And the language that we use on a day-to-day basis is kind of like you could call it downstream language. We already have all these meanings that have already been sedimented in language, and we rely on them and use them again, maybe to describe things in our own way to some extent, but we're dealing with what the sort of repository of meaning that's already in language. So that's part of what I had in mind in the background with language, with poetic language as being sort of language in its dynamic, creative moment, and that's when the poet. So the straitjacket thing has to do with that when I'm in that dynamic state of, capturing something in a slightly novel way through a metaphor or something like that, then I'm no longer just sort of passively receiving the language. I'm in this that's already there, like something sort of external to me. I'm sort of in a way in the heart of the language as this sort of creative process, and it's becoming the language is being individuated through, say, the poet at that moment, the poet who's writing, and not just the poet's not just receiving. Of course, they are receiving too. That's why I have this dynamic play between kind of past and future. We receive the language with everything that's sedimented in it. But as in our poetic mode, we're also bringing that, expanding that language in certain ways. Have I partly answered your question? Guess that's what
I think they might have muted themselves. I'm just checking down the list to see if I can see.
Oh yeah, it looks like they have muted themselves. Yeah.
Here we go. Go ahead, Taylor. Taylor, go ahead. Or Mr. Taylor.
Yeah, sorry, it was saying we were restricted from unmuting ourselves. Yeah, you partly touched on my question. I do have a follow-up, but I know there's other people that have questions, so I'll suspend my follow-up. But thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Fischer.
Mark, it's your turn.
Oh, well, I just kind of raised my hand because, what's happening there? All right, I just raised my hand because I wanted to make sure that I had said that, well, when I sort of tuned into this thing, I was ready to, there were a lot of negative comments that were going, or a few negative comments. I don't know where they come from, what motivated them, but I was ready to be bored and, and dismissive at a lack of depth or whatever. But no, I was stoked. This was, I thought, man, I resonate with you, Luke. This is so, so me, and I thought, wow, this is very good. This is very deep, very profound, very meaningful, and very worthwhile. So I want to make sure I raised my hand and just said that to you. I myself lack discipline enough to write properly, and I sort of find myself writing much like you, in these fragmentary ways. So, I guess I resonate for that reason as well. Well, look, I had a few things I wanted to reference in my praise of you, but I guess it's pointless doing that. It's enough for me just to say that I wanted to raise my hand and let you know that I was very impressed, and I'm very glad that I was here today. So thank you. That's all I really wanted to say.
Thank you very much, Mark, for that kind comment. I really appreciate it. And I should say, I do welcome the criticisms too, as a philosopher. I won't say that it's proving that they prove my point that philosophy is conflict, but that's part of how we develop our ideas philosophically out of some of these tensions too. But yeah, thank you for those kind words.
George, your turn.
Thank you. So I really appreciated your response to my questions or comments, observations. And it leads me to this thought, which is, ultimately what you said, which I found important, which is to say in Hegel, as in many continental philosophers, there are inflection points, if we can use that language. In poetry, there's inflection points, certain lines that, in a sense, or even in Shakespeare, right? They're inflection points. So the body of work leads to this inflection point that encapsulates the argument, encapsulates some important idea, and it's very pithy. Okay. And so, but see, my issue, and again, I find that to be important. I find that to be important what you're doing. Indeed, I'm gonna give this one example, and this is from a work of literature, Huckleberry Finn. I don't know if you're familiar with that novel. It's considered to be one of the greatest American novels, and there's an inflection point in that novel that's regularly referenced, where Huck Finn, it's set in antebellum South while slavery still exists, he befriends Jim, who's a runaway slave, and they have this adventure, sailing down the Mississippi River together. And of course, Huck came, to this process with his very vile prejudices against African Americans, but he sees the humanity in Jim. And so there's a very famous inflection point in that novel where Huck says to himself, basically saying, I don't care what people say about African Americans. I don't care what people say about Jim. If I go to hell, so be it. And so there's an inflection point in that novel. And indeed, in many movies and there's inflection points. And so I guess, I can see that's what you're doing, right? You're sort of, again, continental, you're hitting the inflection points, which is very valuable, even to be able to identify the inflection points. And so, okay, these are the inflection points in these bodies of thought. This is the sort of kernel of wisdom that we could see manifest. The issue, again, I come back to the fragment, and mind you, I'm not. Have you ever seen this? This was in vogue. I want to say about 20 years ago. There will be these, I don't know, these road signs that say, okay, between 7 and 9, that the road's going to be closed. Well, artists took those, and they would put pithy statements, a series of pithy statements in those that I thought were really quite philosophical. And so I was very disappointed once because I actually, saw one of the artists and she gave a talk. And I'm like, how do you choose these? Because they seem to be quite insightful. And she begged off. She's like, oh, I just sort of happenstance or whatever the case may be, which was a very disappointing response. Because again, the Fragments, right, artist Fragment, was, again, and this was popular. I remember going to Amsterdam airport, 2001. And I sat there, I couldn't stop reading the fragments as they were popping up. And I had to see the whole cycle because they were so interesting. But this is my point. So again, I'm going to push back on the fragment idea, right? Because this is what, you're presenting it. Okay, these are fragments. Fragments can give us knowledge. And again, I really think, I'm going to say this, okay? I really think framing it more so as inflection points, because again, I keep coming back to this idea that fragments, at the core of fragments, is also hate and ignorance, right? In that if you ever listen to the far right, they like to operate the little fragments, little tidbits of knowledge, not even knowledge, but little tidbits, right? They really like to hit those kind of fragmentary partial knowledge to really push their hate. And again, you see it very clearly in Nietzsche. So all I'm saying is that in pushing this idea of fragments, I guess I would say, you have to philosophically, again, I submit to you, it's not so much, and again, I'm just pushing here because again, I'm trying to be constructive, and what you're saying is that there are ways to look at certain philosophers and certain works of art, and that it is intellectually and analytically valuable to look at these works of art and philosophy and look at them as inflection points, right? This is where the argument reaches a crescendo, right? This is where, if you know the body of thought or whatever the case may be, this really, again, really encapsulate and is very powerful. And it really, in one or two or three lines, it captures the argument in a very powerful way, right? And I think that's really what you're saying. And so instead of fragments, I guess I would say inflections. And again, because the problem is that I hear fragments and I'm like, well, what about this dark side of fragments, right? If you're going to push fragments, right, how do you not become prey to the idea that you are pushing a kind of intellectualism, which can be very anti-intellectual and very hateful? And so, I really like the idea inflection points, I have to say. I may actually use that at some time. I really like inflection points because it really, in my opinion, it really gets at what you're doing. And you do it very well. I mean, it's great listening to you and Hegel. Absolutely. I agree. When I read continental philosophers, it's almost painful to some extent because you're like, wow, that's such a powerful statement. And you wish you could actually put it in your pocket or something and walk around with it, and show it to people because it's a very powerful inflection point, right? And it's sort of like a moment, what is it? They say, what is it? Orifice? They, like this Greeks, they say, in terms of artwork, I can only appear to you in moments. In other words, the art, the inflection point of the art, the point at which you get moved. I can only appear with you at moments because if I'm always here, you would never be able to see me, that kind of thing, right? And so I guess I really hope I'm making some kind of contribution in your mind to what I'm saying, and especially the idea that fragments again can be used to nefarious ends and frequently are used to nefarious ends. And so I hope I'm making sense to you in that sense, in that way.
Yeah, I think thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, I think what you're saying about inflection points, or say that Hegel example as well. Again, I'd say that's only a part of what I'm saying, and the context of my argument in the essay to do with like taking Hegel as an example is to sort of move beyond some kind of simple opposition between fragmented system or systematic forms of argumentation versus the fragment, as if these are two completely different things that have no relationship to one another. So it's only and to take Hegel as an example, when he explicitly sees philosophy as going beyond well, certainly anything fragmentary, but beyond anything, figurative language to the concept and so on. But I think once, and fragments do have this life of their own, right? I mean, that's, if you think of, Heraclitus, that you can't step into the same river twice. It's like with a myth that has this, huge kind of, it has this, almost like procreative power that it sort of develops in history, and everyone can take something from that and apply it to a certain situation and so on. Or nature loves to hide, which Pierre Hadot wrote a whole book sort of, taking that as his starting point from Heraclitus on nature in the history of philosophy. But there's the other question is a collation of fragments or a collection of fragments. If we can say that that's what Heraclitus gave us, there's a different question to ask. Well, how does that statement fit into Heraclitus's thinking? Then how does it live as something in the broader culture? Because that's only a very small aspect of Heraclitus that we can only step into the same river twice. He also has the logos, which is not above this sort of temporal order of becoming and so on. So I think there's it's not just like an inflection point or something that stands alone, and that's why I think it's important to think of fragments in relation to one another. or part of why I think that is an important thing. The other point is, I think, what your point about, I mean, there's so many, wisdom traditions and so on where fragmentary roads are right. I mean, one book on the fragment, talks about, the parables from the New Testament as being examples of, sayings, the sayings of Jesus, and like in different traditions, and Heraclitus fits in that a bit too, like and these forms are different. Like I think the modern fragment is not doing exactly what Heraclitus is doing, and certainly other traditions like the Koan in Buddhism and so on, they're all doing slightly different things, and it's not just one genre of pithy writing. I mean, sardonic maxims and so on are doing their own commentary on society and have a slightly different angle to them. But I don't think, I guess I don't think the fragment in itself is pernicious, but I can see what you're saying about fragmentation at the same time, and understand your concerns. I guess in the position of reading someone who writes aphoristically or draws on aphorism and so on, I guess it's a question to the reader, like, does this make sense? Because I think what you find in really brilliant fragmentary writers, like I particularly like Novalis, is although he wrote most of these things in notebooks and they weren't intended for publication, but he did also write Pollen, for example, which he published in his lifetime, this selection of fragments. But you get the sense of someone who's really aware of like the philosophy of his time and the history of philosophy to some extent, and a lot of thought, is doing something very innovative in philosophy, has this kind of distinctive philosophical orientation within that context and so on. So I think it's very different from reading some crazy right-wing tweet or something. But I maybe where something fruitful here is to speak of, because I try to place the fragment as actually being related to a whole. So I distinguish, not everyone does this, of course, but I distinguish between fragment, like the fragment is not an instance of fragmentation in the sense of like all coherent thought or narrative or so on. So, but maybe there's a fruitful, I don't know, question there of like, what are different modes of the fragmentary? So I think I'm open to what you're saying, to the extent that yes, some ways in which fragmentary writing and speech happen are problematic and concerning for the reasons you say, but I would just not want to sort of lump all forms of fragmentary writing into that one.
I really want to thank you for your response, because actually, I was going to say thank you for your response. It was very elucidating and it was a very effective response. Thank you very much. It really helped me understand this even more deeply. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thanks, George. Thanks for your interesting thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Michelle, your turn. Unmute yourself.
There we go. Thank you, David. To help me, and I have a couple of different things that I want to ask you, Doctor. And sorry for not addressing you as Dr. Fischer before. I have been up for over 24 years.
Luke is fine. It's okay. It's fine.
Yeah. But to understand this fragmentation thing a little bit better, and I guess before I get on to that, I just want to get through a little bit of a formality first. If this is okay with David, and of course with your permission, Doctor, Luke, would you be willing to stay on for a wee little bit after we end this discussion, to answer some questions for me, like a little bit? Maybe
a little bit. I do have some people coming over shortly, but I certainly a few minutes. It's fine. Yeah.
And so my question, to better understand fragmented poetry, is there any style of poetry that you would consider maybe like, okay, so fragmented poetry and whole poetry, like poetry that stands alone? It's about one whole thing. It's a unifying poem. Do you know what I'm getting at?
Yeah, it's a very it's a big subject. Yeah, I mean, I'm not quite sure how to answer. I mean, I do talk about these different senses of the fragmentary a little bit in the essay and in the book. At least that, yeah, these different connotations of the fragmentary. I mean, I would see someone like Beckett as kind of maybe for good reason, and wanting to show something about his contemporary world, but it's sort of the coherence doesn't happen. It stays at the level of a kind of fragmentation that he wants to, in a way, show, expose, explore, which I think is quite different, from what you get in the early Romantics, where the fragment, well, firstly, there's more organic metaphors for the fragment, like a seed. So it's a sense of something that's, if you take that metaphor a bit further, then a seed also emerges from a whole, right? It comes from a plant, and it develops into a whole. I think in terms of poetry, I mean, there are just so many different approaches to contemporary poetry, so it's hard for me to just choose out a few examples. But I guess, yeah, there are some poets that are more consciously, in a way, aiming for something fragmentary that isn't meant to really cohere, you could say, and others who remain a bit more lyrical and a bit more aiming to get at a more holistic experience of the world and so on. Maybe that's something we could talk about after
So
the
you would
session.
So you would say there is fragmented poetry and non-fragmented poetry, where can we make those two categorical distinctions?
Yeah, I mean, you're using fragmented in this at this moment in the sense of a fragment that is kind of no longer relates to any whole or no longer suggests any whole, right? That's what you're meaning by fragment. Yeah, I would say that some poetry is less fragmented than other poetry. Yeah.
Well, thank you for answering my questions. Appreciate it.
Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. John. Go ahead, John.
You can hear me, can you?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Right, yes. We had a very interesting case here in Melbourne, Victoria, about a fragment that amused many people. We had a road sign that says Form 1 lane. Then someone got busy and added 2 letters to it, and that was P and T. And so many of the Form 1 lane signs became Form 1 planet, which I thought was a very interesting concept. And I always like seeing it. That's one of the graffiti around Melbourne that I thought, well, it was clever and also very important. So anyway, that's just sort of another slant at fragmentary. What I want to really comment on is that some of what you have said in your fragments in some way was using words that I've heard in the works and the thought of Carl Jung, his depth psychology. For instance, he was very, very concerned about 2 levels of mental activity and understanding a reality. He had the surface philosophical level of the scientific, the materialistic, the rational and the logical, but he also was concerned about the subsurface or the deeper level of the poetical or the mythological, the metaphorical, and there had the two functions that he was concerned about were feelings and intuitions over against the first ones, which were thinking, sensation and thinking more on the surface in the materialistic realm. Now, you brought that out very well. Quite often you mentioned, the contrast between the philosophical and the poetical. And the other thing of interest was that you kept mentioning contradictions and polarities. And of course, Jung's whole individuation process, which you also mentioned, was concerned with bringing together the polarities. Not necessarily paradoxes, but polarities of the masculine and the feminine and that sort of thing, the rational and the logical. And so the task of individuation process then in the long run is to resolve the conflicts by bringing them together in a bio-psycho-socio-cosmic wholeness. And so I just want to comment that it seemed to me that quite a bit of your language was reflecting Jung, and I'm just wondering if that is something you did consciously.
Yeah, thank you for that great question. No, the short answer is I didn't consciously sort of invoke Jung or allude to Jung's language there, but I think the sort of resonance that you're pointing to is there, and I think that probably, I mean, I've read some Jung and also Jungian literature and found it engaging and very interesting. But I think part of that might also have to do with a kind of common background in the German tradition that Jung was also coming out of, because I think those things are all important in the broadly romantic tradition. And one person I mentioned, and I always find I've always found illuminating, sort of pre-romantic, but same time as Friedrich Schiller, and his view of the aesthetic is that in the aesthetic, this kind of opposition between the sensuous parts of human nature and the rational parts of human nature are integrated in this sort of distinctive way, and which is also an integration of the person. So I think, and you find those sorts of the emphasis on obviously opposition, contradiction in German idealism and early German romanticism, and then going in terms of later influences, Owen Barfield is an English philosopher who was very much, and writer who was very much working in a kind of romantic tradition. Also, polarity is a very key term for him, and he partly developed that drawing on Coleridge, and who was also drawing on Schelling, but that you can have rather than a simple opposition, there are forms of polarity where you have there's sort of two sides of one coin. So an example in one of my fragments, and in Goethe you find this in his color theory too. There's I talk about intellectual interiority and a kind of exterior empiricism as two sides. In a way, I see them as two sides of the same form of consciousness or shape of consciousness, you could say, with the poetic as integrating those in a deeper way, for example, such that we find something like an inwardness in the phenomena and a meaningfulness in the phenomena, and something that might poetic, potentially a bit more mythical, and so on. So I think the resonance with Jung is there, and I have to think about that more. So thank you for those thoughts. But probably has to do at least as much with a kind of an intellectual history that Jung is also drawing on himself. Yeah.
Could I just comment that Jung didn't seem to say much about his debt to the poet tradition and the idealist tradition, but he did quite often mention the work of Kant. and how he's gone on that. So I somehow think that publicly he was concerned about his scientific status. When he was dealing with the science, he wanted to show that that was a genuine scientific object of study. And so he just didn't make much mention. Perhaps he mentioned Goethe and several others, but not in any lengthy way. So it's as if he was presenting something quite independently of everybody, really. So anyway, he's an interesting figure, and I just saw so many ideas that coincide.
That's very interesting. Yeah. I think I did want to comment on the thing you mentioned about this road sign. I think that's a great kind of almost like fragmentary public art. What you mentioned, turning Form 1 lane into Form 1 planet. Because I think there's always a context in which we understand the fragment, and that kind of suddenly shifts the context, right? The Form 1 lane. So I think that's quite striking. But that
Thank
anecdote.
you.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, John. Philip, your turn.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Luke, for such a fantastic presentation. It's a bit cryptic, though. I just want to comment. Wait, my first question to you, Dr. Luke, did you mention the word or a person by the name of Navales?
Yes.
Oh, you did? Okay. That's the Russian politician?
Sorry, the sound is not entirely clear. Could you just say that again?
The Russian.
No, the early German romantic. So he was a friend of Friedrich Schlegel's, Novalis. That was his pen name. His actual name was Friedrich von Hardenberg.
Oh, the one who went against Putin is Novalis. So I was speaking of him.
Okay, I can't hear so well, but yes, yeah.
All right. Okay, maybe I'll try to take another position. My question, I'm just going to address this point. There is the anti-fragment people in this group versus, let's say, the completeness of a text here in the discussion. But I want to remind the audience and get the confirmation from you, Doc Luke, that a lot of the works, especially during medieval time, Plato and Aristotle, weren't they all fragments also?
Yeah.
Okay? And is it true that Aquinas did not really read Aristotle in the text, but read commentaries on Aristotle? That's one. Another thing is, when you look at the music sheets, for example, Bach, the Baroque music composers, they never write out everything. A lot of them were placed by the musicians. So my gathering is the anti-fragmented people in the group are looking for purity of the text, which, in my experience, never really exists, even in contemporary texts like Karl Marx. There are some ambiguous areas there, including the Bible, of course. A lot of them are fragments. Now, you went into fragments of poetry. Now, poetry has more liberal interpretation, let's say, than well, if I read Nietzsche, I have a more liberal interpretation versus Hegel or Kant because of the poetry involved. What do you think?
Yeah, so I think, that's a really good point about the fragment, because I think, one of the things I like about the figure of the fragment as some sense a metaphor is that it's relevant to so many different areas. And one of the sections in my essay is on language more generally, but drawing on this fragment by Novalis. And in a sense, what I'm saying is that the fragment in, let's say, its more conscious form, the sort of philosophical fragment, or even, you know, fragments in art and so on, that might be aiming for analogous things, that it's really a kind of intensification of things like the character of language, for example, that in whatever I say, there's always the unsaid, or I'm always implying more than I could, you know, articulate. Then it's just sort of, you know, language is not, it's not like your understanding is a glass of water and I have the meaning and I just pour it in, right? There's always this interpretive process where there's a much larger context. There's much that's being implied. There might be things that I'm implying that I don't even realize I'm implying in what I'm saying, and so on. So the fragment, in a way, in suggesting more with less, is in a sense sort of highlighting something about communication more generally and language. And that's right, that you know, a lot of these ancient texts, we only have, well, if you're talking about the entire corpus, we just have fragments. We only have we don't have all the writings of the Greek playwrights and so on. We only have very few of the hundreds that they wrote, and so on, and the same with philosophy. And I think it's, to some extent, whether something seems a fragment or it seems complete, it depends on the sort of angle that we look at it from, you know, because seen from a different vantage point. Yeah, I give this example of, say, Michelangelo's David, for example. You could say that it's a perfectly complete work of art, but it makes sense within a tradition of art. You know, the Renaissance kind of reinterpretation of classical art and philosophy and so on, within a certain ideal that arose at that time. But if we step back from it, it's not like the whole of art is somehow contained in that work. It then seems like, well, this is just a fragment of art history in a sense. And so maybe I'm speaking too broadly, but I think the fragment has a richness to it in that it can shed light on quite different phenomena. And yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Philip. Gulnos, your turn.
Thank you. Most probably, I've got a couple of thoughts. Most probably, I'm gonna contradict myself, but like Walt Whitman said it in his poem, I contradict myself. Let it be. I contradict. So what? I'm butchering right now his poem. I am a universe. I'm large. I'm a multitude. That's the thing about poetry, contradicts itself, and you are a fool if you argue with the poet or with the poem. I think Wittgenstein said it right. That's the problem of the language. But the thing is, even the philosophers commit the same mistake, because we all know language is an imitation of reality. Words are images of things. If that is the case, like I'm gonna butcher again Wittgenstein's quote. It's not don't think that you are doing the thinking. You are doing the thinking within the words or within the language you express yourself. We are somehow limited with words in our own capacity of the language. So both ways, I think philosophy as well as poetry contradicts itself. And the second point I wanted to make about the Plato mentioned about poetry versus philosopher, and he gave very harsh metaphor for poetry, saying poetry is like yelping bitch. It's a dog. Sorry for the word. It's his words, yeah. It's a yelping bitch shrieking at her own master. It's a very harsh metaphor. What do you think about it? Because somehow, if poetry is really giving this poetic prose like a verbiage, full of contradictions, maybe we are not getting we're not after the truth behind the truth. We are just making a lot of noise, creating just unnecessary waffle, just the image that we're giving, we're talking about the truth in poetry. But again, I'm going to contradict myself because I want to defend Nietzsche. He's one of my favorite philosophers. I'm a layman in philosophy, and I hope I'm going to always stay as a layman. And Nietzsche's way is not about right or wrong. Nietzsche is all about difference. He showed things differently, and he said it differently. And that's amazing. And Nietzsche says himself, his reflexive nature is a predatory nature, and his imaginative poetic nature is always a prey to his reflexive nature. And I love those words as well. And his lines, if you gaze long enough into an abyss, the abyss will gaze back into you. Oh, it's just beautiful. So I contradict myself, but
thank you. Yeah, maybe to talk about contradiction. This is something I think, when Schlegel talks about not having a system, needing a system and not having a system, and he also talks about his own mind as a system of fragments, which seems kind of almost contradictory statement. But I think what he's getting at is that, and I think something appealing about the fragment is that it doesn't start from sort of general abstract concepts and try to create a system that in that kind of way, right? In a sense, fragments emerge as, say, occasional thoughts, or on occasions, moments of illumination. And they can be in contradiction with one another, like the expression of one aspect versus another aspect. But I think at the same time, we can see a kind of cohesion or a kind of wholeness there in interpreting a given writer. And I mean, I've done a lot of work on Rilke, so this is an example that's familiar to me. I think, and as a poet as well, that often a poem emerges out of a particular state of mind in a particular moment, and something that has a kind of validity to it as a human experience or existential experience and so on. But that can, in a certain sense, seem like it contradicts another moment. And I see this in Rilke scholarship, to give a more abstract example, where some poems seem to be claiming one thing and another poem seems to be claiming something completely different. And some of these revolve around, like, to what degree is there like a kind of metaphysical kind of perspective in Rilke, or what's his interest in spirituality? Is he just playing on these ideas, or is there something deeper there, and so on? And I almost see like different scholars will take their poem that sort of validates their own particular perspective, and then sort of ignore other ones. And philosophers do this with poets all the time. They take a line out of a poem and they say, oh, this is Rilke has proposed this. I find part of Heidegger's reading of Rilke a bit like this. He'll take out a statement and turn it into a proposition and then say why it's, problematic philosophically from his perspective. But what gets missed there is to say, okay, there's these all these different poems, right? And they're kind of in tension with one another, but there's a kind of like, if you kind of fluidly read between them, you can see an overall orientation, right? You can see that the poet has an overall orientation and find a kind of cohesion there. So I think there's a way of, that contradiction or apparent contradiction can be sort of true to human experience, but it doesn't mean there's no cohesion. It's just, it's just not one that's being arrived at through some purely abstract mode of like forming a systematic argument or something like that, and avoiding contradiction at all cost.
Just a thought, poetry is all about artistic mastery, yeah? And I read it somewhere, poetry conceals truth only wise are capable of to perceive. I don't understand. Why do we have to disguise truth, conceal truth is it the play of words? Which again, philosophers also commit the same error, that they conceal the truth only wise are capable to perceive. Do we have to play those word games? Game of words.
Yeah, so here
is it necessary again, or is it about only artistic?
Well, I think I think part of the thing that comes into tension with philosophy and poetry, at least some ways of doing philosophy, but most ways of doing philosophy, is the relationship between figurative language and the concept, and the Nietzschean, you stare long enough into the abyss of the best looks like this, this densely kind of figurative and evocative picture that we can probably all find, I think, some truth in, right? It can take plenty of examples where that might resonate with our own sense of the world and so on. But this is a big topic in itself, but I actually think there's a certain priority of the figurative over the conceptual, or what's often thought of as the literal meaning. And you see that in the way that new meaning enters language, that the role of metaphor and figurative language and actually bringing new meaning to language. So I think, contrary to our view of thinking as this pure logical, kind of logical operation, the gray on gray of the concept, I actually think in this more dynamic sort of mode of thinking is actually something much more poetic and almost imaginative. I maybe just leave that as a suggestive statement. So what seems like a disguise, maybe it still is a cloak of the truth. Maybe there's behind that, there's something that might appear no longer in the cloak of a figurative language, let's say. But I think in connection with conceptual language and literal language, that it's actually in a certain sense more immediate and truer to thinking in its intuitive mode, the figurative.
Yeah, thank you, Gulnos. Conrad, your turn.
Yeah, hi, thanks. Just wondering why you use fragment and not aphorism. It's a trivial question, but I find they're synonymous, but the word fragment is continuously used, but not the word aphorism, which is more understood.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It partly has to do with, and there's an interesting book by Joel Westerdale on Nietzsche, and he's talking about the aphorism, because Nietzsche preferred that term aphorism over fragment and other terms. And when he comes to, he's differentiating his perspective a little bit from some other Nietzsche scholars, but he's, to me, the way he ends up defining the aphorism, is pretty much how I would sort of define or think of the fragment. So there's a lot of overlap there, and this the terminology is kind of yeah, it's not settled, you know, there's but my main reason for using the term fragment was because of the inspiration from the early German romantics, or that was one reason I used it. And partly because, I mean, I think in Novalis, for example, and Schlegel, that in a way you're dealing with just like often, you know, some of them might be particularly witty or paradoxical, like Friedrich Schlegel's Hedgehog or something. But a lot of them are really just a kind of condensed articulation of a thought. And I tend to think of aphorism as maybe I do say this at some point, that I do use them interchangeably in the essay, but at one point I sort of say, from a certain angle, it's maybe worth distinguishing them. And that the aphorism is, perhaps the sort of those most strikingly sort of self-contained fragments where you get the feeling like, maybe they approach something like, sort of something, a kind of poetic distillation even more in their diction, and have this sort of, this more self-enclosed character. So it was, in a way, I chose fragment because I found it a bit more open, a little bit more sort of open as a term that fit with more how I was using, sort of this aphoristic mode of writing. But yeah, there's overlap between them, and aphorism is the more commonly used word. But yeah, there are other short forms. I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah.
I'll just make a follow-up, which is,
yeah.
I think fragment, as you said, would be the more broad umbrella term, which includes could include aphorisms, sayings, maxims, and also just journal jottings, right? This jottings, which is another good word to use. A jotting is different to an aphorism, where an aphorism would be typically highly polished, very carefully selected words, a carefully crafted whole expressing something mysterious. There's layers to it, there's different interpretations, where a fragment could be that, but it could also be just a very simple few sentences which don't necessarily jingo together. It can just be something which is just written in one go without any editing, and more personal, self-expression, and less, what's the word when you're over orchestrating something?
More spontaneous, right, or something like that. Or,
well, maybe in its worst sense, contrived. A lot of aphorisms,
right? Yeah.
Where the fragment, I think your fragments, I think what you've done brilliantly is, by casting such a wide net, you allow yourself latitude, because some of the fragments that you read, when you read about 30 of them, 35 of your fragments, some of them sounded aphoristic and some of them didn't sound aphoristic, in the sense that aphorisms also have a certain beauty and elegance to them, where a fragment may not. So I think the word fragment was very well chosen by you.
Yeah, thanks. You've answered the question better than I think I answered it. So yeah, that's pretty much the reason. And I see that kind of, it's in a way what I see in the early romantics too. There's a kind of both more, fragments that are more like aphorisms in that strong sense, and ones that are really a kind of condensed, a condensed expression of a thought, but not necessarily aiming for those other qualities as much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Darlene, your turn. Darlene. Hello.
Okay. So I just wanted to say that I really, really enjoyed the presentation. And I am I was taking screenshots, and what I'm gonna do is just each day look at a different one. I know I missed some of them, so I'm glad it was recorded. So because I was just like, you could like wake up each morning and just read one of these, or you could read like one or two during the day or whatever. I just really enjoyed it. Thank you. Thank you for
Thanks,
taking your
Darren.
time thank you for taking your time, and I found it to be incredibly artistic. And when people were talking about like the sculpture of David, like one of the things a lot of people feel like is it's like super realistic, but it's actually idealistic, just so it's actually abstract too. So
Yeah.
sometimes when things are realistic, they're abstract too. But that's extra. But the main thing is I just wanted to thank you for coming. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Shannon. Yeah, really appreciate that. And maybe it's a moment to say so the book is it's a very expensive hardcover at the moment, but it will be coming out as a more affordable paperback next year. So, but I had assumed that fewer of you would have read the book unless you happen to sort of get it from a library, because it is very expensive at the moment. But yeah, thank you.
Well, we seem to have run out of comments and questions. Yes. Oh, no, there goes Will. Whoops, Will's disappeared. He's back again.
Oh, there he is.
Go ahead, Will.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Dr. Luke. I'm only jumping in because I'm the special go-to guy for when nobody's got their hand up. And I hate pregnant pauses. So I was going to ask you, what was I thinking? You mentioned intuition in one of the texts, and it's just an interesting discussion in itself. What it actually entails, intuition. Whether you believe that there is such a thing. Even some people say there's nothing particularly uncanny about intuition, because it just must be some sort of dissemination of information at some level of which we're not necessarily aware of. So I just wondered, a bit of a question without notice, sorry, but I'm just wondering of your thoughts on intuition. If any. Just jump in.
So so I see intuition in the sense of I mean, maybe sometimes I would use the word to mean like, what we mean, like with a hunch and that kind of thing, but I mean it in the more philosophical sense, where we have more discursive thinking or thought, where we sort of elaborate an argument step by step. And the intuitive thinking, or intuition for me, is the moment when we have a new thought or a new perspective on a subject matter. And you can take examples from science, like Newton theorizing gravity for the first time, and so on, or a poet conceiving a new work of art at that moment when a new poem announces itself, and so on. So I think maybe there are different forms of intuition, but I don't see it as in a way I align it with something like a vertical phenomenon. There's a verticality for me in the moment of intuition, and I think it's something more like a moment of illumination rather than something happening at a sort of discursive horizontal level. And I don't think it is just kind of passively receiving something from elsewhere, because what happens, at least in more significant moments of insight, is that it reorganizes the knowledge that we previously had and the perspective that we previously had. So you have a new thought, and you see the whole problem differently. And to me, that's a moment of Yeah, I mean, I use an analogy with Greek drama, like the moment when Oedipus realizes that he's actually killed his father and married his mother, like that all the actions of his life at that moment are reorganized in that moment of a recognition. And I think we have something happening similar, like on an intellectual level happens when we have a new thought or perspective that reorganizes the whole way that we see a subject matter or problem. Yeah. I mean, my other approach to it would be, because I have a serious interest in phenomenology, that we should attempt to sort of self-examine, what's happening in our intellectual life in different modes, but that's sort of my perspective on it. And I hope that gives at least some food for thought.
Because I was just thinking recently that perhaps intuition, like there's a separate or component of the mind that's sort of operating in the background that we're not necessarily aware of, and then we get sort of little revelations occasionally, even in dreams. I think the fact that you can dream something perhaps in relation to an event through the day, through the week, and it pops up in the dreamscape, which seems to show that there's this other mechanism at play that we're not necessarily consciously aware of. And I think perhaps that could be sort of allude towards intuition itself.
No, I think there are those
Fascinating.
unconscious dimensions, and I think I think there's, with certain discoveries and new insights, I think it's not infrequently the case that someone will be working on a particular problem or thinking something through for a long time, and then the sort of the solution comes to them when they're not thinking about it, or in a dream or something. So I think, yes, that does certainly overlap with part of what I'm talking about.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Will. Conrad, your turn.
Thank you, David. I thought if I could ask you, Luke, since your whole presentation was about your fragments, maybe you could comment on a couple that I wrote down. I'll just read three little ones. I'll read one, and then if you can comment what it means to you. So the first one was, artists feel the ideas that philosophers think.
That was part of a longer fragment. I mean, this is partly I'm trying to think of how to approach this a little bit more methodically and not anecdotally, but maybe sort of anecdotes come to mind, which is sometimes there's some really brilliant artists and who are really opening up kind of new perspectives, I think, in their work and new ways of relating to the world and so on. But they can be terrible at articulating what they're doing sometimes. There are others who are brilliant at sort of also talking about their work. But I think, there's something, I think also in art, there is this, generally speaking, kind of affective dimension that's very important to art. So, feeling, I think is very important to most art, and the sort of artistic mode of working is sort of one that engages us at that, well, also at the sensible level, but also effectively, and so on. And the rest of that is that's the part of the aspect of the artist, and the other side of it is about philosophers thinking ideas but not feeling them. And there I have in mind that we can have this tendency, I think, all when we enter that sort of purely rational mode, and maybe this, I don't know if it's too much to say that Schiller was was sort of also pointing to this. I think he probably was, but yeah, when we're in that purely intellectual mode, we can be think things through very clearly, but somehow it might not really move us on that more individual, in sort of in an individual embodied way.
Okay, let me ask
So we could be a bit sort of abstracted from what maybe the relevance of our ideas and so on. So I think the artistic and the feeling and thinking come together. I think a lot of poets, for example, this is something to say about Rilke, that he wasn't a philosopher, but he wrote these poems that have this kind of philosophical depth to them that also address us at this more effective sort of, in this more affective and immediately existential sort of way. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. And the second fragment that you wrote is art is the creative becoming of the individual. Art is the creative becoming of the individual. Can you talk a little bit about that and about your personal experience of that particular fragment?
Yeah, so I say, art is the creative becoming of the world, and then I have this sort of a sequence of fragments, the three that I read. So they kind of immediately kind of bounce off each other and relate to each other. But yeah, there's a creative development of the individual, creative becoming of the world, the individual, and then the fragment that we can't actually disconnect those two. Maybe the shortest route to an answer to that question has a little bit to do with what I think is going on in the view of the absolute in early Romanticism, and one that I tend to share. It's not the only angle, because I also talk about evolution in this way as being art, but part of what's going on there is, I mean, I think there was this strong recognition that what's happening in human creativity is, it's not purely subjective, that it's actually the kind of at once the creativity of the individual and someone like Schelling or Novalis, the sort of creative becoming of nature and the world, and that those two are unified in some way in this process. But yeah, it relates more generally to things that I think about in terms of evolution and
And this quickly,
so,
just the last one, because I know other people have been patiently waiting. Your last quote, which is probably one of the most interesting ones, and I just wanted to make a comment on it, and then if you could comment on my comment. So your quote.
Sorry, my daughter is interrupting me. Yes. Okay, yeah, I know. There's still questions, that's why. Okay, I'll be there soon. Okay. Sorry, it was a bit unclear to me whether the event is going till 4 or 6 p.m. from the answers. I'm happy to answer questions, but we have some guests who arrived, so my daughter just was informing me of that. But yeah, do ask your question.
This is my absolute last question and last. I just thought it'd be nice for me to read back some of your own fragments, since it'd be nice for people to hear them in case they missed your presentation. You said the separation of the self and the world is an abstraction and illusion. Now, my comment is, and what I like your comment on my comment, which is, would you include in that fragment that the separation is an illusion, is of that the separation of the self and the world and the absolute is an illusion? Would you include the word absolute in there as well?
Yeah, so I would, if I understand your question correctly, I would say that the absolute is where those two things, or wherein they are united. Yeah.
Beautiful.
So yeah.
Thank you, Luke.
Thank Thank you very much, Conrad.
By the way, Conrad, the session today is being recorded, so it will appear within a couple of days on our YouTube channel. The link to which should be on the meetup page. Gulnaz, go ahead.
Aristotle compared poets with historians, modern philosophers, and he said historians write about what happened, but poets write about what might happen. Yeah, what might happen, that possibility, like earlier you said, stimulates the imagination, thinking. But then I am thinking there is a lot of drama in the poets. I am partially emotivist as well, but first I'm a Kantian utilitarian thinker and then emotivist. And my question is, I believe that our emotions set us on fire and we set the world on fire in return. So there is this very self-destructive and destructive element to poetry, or to the emotivism to some degree.
There's a destructive element, did you say?
Disruptive, yeah, disruptive.
Disruptive, not...
Yeah, disrupts. Mm-hmm.
Disruptive, like destroying?
Destructive. Destroying.
Destructive. Okay. Yeah, I would... so I think that art and poetry inspires us and stimulates us and so on, and in that sense, to that degree, I think I agree with you, but I wouldn't say that it's destructive, because I think, at least in general, one of the amazing things about art is that I can be really sad, right, and I listen to a sad, beautiful piece of music, and somehow I become reconciled to my sadness, or it becomes, almost has an element of joy that kind of is there in my sadness. And so I think art has this power it engages us, our feeling life, our emotions, and so on. But it at the same time transfigures them a bit, brings them into this different, which to me often seems like it's not destructive, but maybe there are examples in which it is. But I think you're on mute, or yeah.
Go ahead, Conrad.
I think Gulnaz, I wanted to follow up something there, if that's okay.
I see, yes. I'll see if I can find her on the list. Oh, here we are, yes. Go ahead, Gulnaz.
Sorry, because there's a lot of noise, I have to keep muting myself. So yeah, emotions. The rational thinking helps us definitely to understand the problems better than emotions. But somehow we always get emotional first and then try to solve the problem. In aftermath, that 2020 vision is perfect. The hindsight comes after rational thinking. I think that can be very destructive. That there's not much rational thinking in poetry. It's very emotional, and there are a lot of parasite words. I would say, like, I'm sorry, guys, I don't want to be a not compassionate woman here, but there are a lot of words like compassion, empathy, sympathy can be used and abused against us sometimes. It can be very much misused. And all are because of poetry, poetic thinking. There's a lot of emotivism that doesn't solve problems, creates problems.
I think
problems.
you might be right. I think what Schiller was already onto, though, that I think is important, is that there's a certain mode of rationality. Maybe it's the predominant mode, which rather than sort of engaging feeling, it just abstracts us and from it. I'm not saying this is bad in itself. Like it's good to be able to be in the state of pure thinking that has its value and so on. But I think what can happen through the art and poetry is this kind of integration, of those, more sort of affective life and I think there is thinking in art and poetry too, maybe not always to the same degree depending on the artist or poet, but I think it's there too, and art, often, with really difficult subject matter as well, art allows us to sit with it, and it's not like a purely rational thing, like people turn to a poem when a loved one's died or something like that. So it's a bit different from maybe, rationally or reading existentialist philosophy on being towards death or something like that. But it's, I think it allows, there's something. It allows us to be with the phenomena in a way that is centered, let's say, and not opposed to reason. Yeah. But yeah, there's certainly a plurality of modes in which art, appears and exists, and so I'm not saying that what you're entirely disagreeing, but I think art can often have this more integrative, power.
Thank you. Michelle, your turn.
Yeah, so you got company, so I'll make this quick and I'll try and get through some of the questions that I wanted to ask you privately. Can you list any movies in recent pop culture in the cinemas, or maybe something in the theater, Broadway, off-Broadway, or opera, that is fragmented, or novels that are fragmented? Can there be a fragmented novel? Do you have an idea that maybe one day you'll write a fragmented novel? Like the Bible is history, the Bible as a novel, the Bible is literature. Would you ever take that on?
I'm sure there are a lot of works that are working with fragments in different ways. I mean, cinema is definitely not something that I've given a lot of thought to in terms of the fragment. But I think the fragment is appears in all different art forms, and I mean this is going back, but one of my first attempts to write something, not write fragments themselves, but write about the fragment, was actually through working on Rilke, who was close to Auguste Rodin, the sculptor. So we're going back a while, 100 years or so. But Rodin did all these fragments, like the Walking Man, which is headless, or a sculpture that's just a hand, and so on. And he was partly inspired too by historical fragments of sculpture. When we only receive part of an ancient work, and the rest is been destroyed or lost. But doing this in a more deliberate way, and I think there's probably very many different ways in which fragments are being explored in different media. I'd have to give it some more thought, but yeah.
And my other question was this: what are your opinion? I just have to know, because you're just a fantastic writer. So I want to ask you this opinion, because I have Dr. Seuss is one of my favorite writers of all time, and of course Shakespeare. But Dr. Seuss was an amazing genius, and do you think any of his writings are fragmented to a certain extent? And then if so, how? But then what are your overall feelings about Dr. Seuss as a writer?
So I just want to highlight again that I want to distinguish the fragmentary from the fragmented, and I think you mean the fragmentary, like in the sense of the fragment in this, not the sense in which it's totally alienated from some whole, but actually giving expression to a whole. So, Dr. Seuss, yeah, so my daughter loves Dr. Seuss. I love Dr. Seuss when I was a child, and my wife doesn't like Dr. Seuss because she just finds him too weird. But the fragment in Dr. Seuss, oh, I don't know. Where do you see the fragment in Dr. Seuss? I mean, there's the humor, there's the kind of preposterous and just like, you know, these fictional creatures that are totally impossible and, you know, absurd,
Right.
but funny at the same time, and the poetry that's, you know,
Well,
humorous.
I wasn't saying that, like, the thought just came into my mind all of a sudden as you were speaking. And I was like, I was thinking about some Dr. Seuss books, and I was like, there doesn't seem to be any fragmentation that, like, he's the kind that you're talking about. But I just had to ask, and so, I mean, you know, I wanted to see if you can maybe bring that up, or kind of churn through that for me and see if you thought there's any fragmentation in Seuss. But yeah.
I mean, there's a kind of, I mean, maybe in the humor, like, but I would say it maybe has to do with, yeah, more like fragmentation, but humorous, like coupling things together that are just incongruous, you know, whatever, having a 13-legged creature or something like that, or
Yeah.
yeah, and you know, like the shoe on the wall, and you know, buildings floating in the air, and all this kind of thing. So I think there's a humor and kind of like playing with what we take to be sort of the laws of the world, and which
Right.
might be compared to sort of humorous, might have some connection to more, you know, witty, humorous forms of aphoristic writing too. Yeah, not sure. Yeah, I mean I mean, wit has to do with. I mean, Schlegel also talked about wit, and it's very important in the French tradition of aphoristic writing, and but yeah, wit has to do with, in a way, usually there's some kind of like synthesis at the end, which draws together things that we think of as incongruous, but somehow connects them.
And if I had
yeah.
if I had to press you on one more thing, and please forgive me if I've taken up too much of your time. But could you call fragmentation like complete partial form, and like something a little more whole would be complete form? You getting what I'm saying?
Partial form and complete form,
or partial whole and complete whole.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always I think that these things are sort of relative because because of the way in which any whole, like the most complete and perfect poem, it's not like it's not like a static, it's not like an object that I can just passively receive. I have to bring the poem to life. I have to interpret the meaning of the language, you know, feel its rhythms and all these things. So it's always always encountering a fragment that I have to, into some extent, make into a kind of living whole. And the same with philosophical fragments and philosophical writing that yeah, in a sense, the most complete work is still something. Yeah, it's not given to me in its completeness. It's something that I have to complete through my own interpretation and activity. So maybe, yeah, there's maybe degrees of how fragmented something is, and so things, some things are more open in a way and require more interpretation, and at least on first glance less coherent, and others that seem more coherent to begin with.
Shall we make Stephen our last? Have you got time for him or not?
Yeah, let's make that our last. I'm coming soon. Okay. I'm coming. Yeah. Okay. You can just tell everyone that I'm going to be there in 2 minutes. Okay. So.
Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, a bit curious with a number of figures there, sort of stuff the Steiner people would be into, the Rudolf Steiner crowds. And I can't say I understand his philosophy much. I thought as a philosopher, he could be a bit interesting. He had a number of interesting points. He seemed to place an emphasis, we'll say, in our modern time. We suffer from a passivity of the will. And so, Schopenhauer or Goethe, he seems to think that we must bring up the will into our personal aspect in life. And of course, one of his central features is he complained that the sociability of the modern man is very poor. And he felt that this needed to be corrected. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on Rudolf Steiner.
Yeah, I do. He was, obviously, he was started out as a Goethe scholar too, and was very important in the early, neglected scientific writings of Goethe. And I see Steiner as very much in the Romantic philosophical tradition, and as an important figure in that tradition. Often because of the vastness of his corpus, as you probably know, and the very many different subjects he's touched on, I think a lot of people don't know sort of how to make sense of any of it. But I think he's very important figure in this kind of Romantic tradition, and definitely in terms of my specific thoughts of on poetry and poetry in relation to philosophy. I mentioned Owen Barfield a couple of times, and Barfield was very seriously interested in Steiner's work.
One of the Tolkien little circles.
Yeah, so he was in the Inklings. He was one of the Inklings, good friends with C.S. Lewis, and and I think in Barfield too and Steiner, there is an emphasis on kind of importance of imagination and art as well, and trying to bring together I guess through Goethe as a kind of predecessor, that Goethe sort of brought these different aspects together in a certain way, this scientific approach to nature, but in a way enriched by a kind of more poetic mode of understanding.
Interesting, as though he complained they were treating children as empty vases to be filled. It's just a very mechanical sort of process, method.
No, I think that's right. There's an emphasis on in his philosophy of freedom as well, which built on Fichte's work to some extent, an emphasis on self activity and rather than this passive. I think that's right, passive reception.
Thank you very much.
Of the world.
Well, thank you, Luke.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you for those so many questions and comments. I hope I did all right in trying to respond to so many perspectives and comments, and but it was a pleasure to engage with you all, and
well, please think about addressing us again at some future date.
That would be a pleasure. Thank you very much, David.
So let's all thank Luke for his presentation. Great. Oh well, we'll let you get back to your guests.
Yeah, sorry about that. I mean, I guess we were intending to go to 4, so it's a good sign. Fragments obviously stimulate conversation. It's now 5 p.m, so that's great. Yeah.
Good. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, David. All the best.